The Daviess County Courthouse in Gallatin, Missouri, sits on the east side of the square, a three-story brick building with a copper-green dome that has watched the county's fortunes rise and fall since 1888. On the morning of August 9th, Ruth Mast sat in Harold Kincaid's Ford pickup in the parking lot off Jackson Street and looked at the building for a moment before she picked up her composition notebook from the bench seat and stepped out into the heat. Harold was 63 and had been driving Amish families in the Jamesport community for 11 years. He knew better than to ask questions about what someone was doing at the courthouse. He said he'd be in the truck with the windows down and that she should take whatever time she needed. The collector's office was on the ground floor, east corridor. The annual tax sale had been posted in the Daviess County Democrat the previous 3 weeks in a row as required by Missouri statute, and the list of delinquent parcels ran to 4 pages in small type. The Brubaker ground was listed on page 2, parcel 074.029.00003.01, 23.17 acres. Delinquent taxes, penalties, and fees, 3,291. Minimum bid, 3,300. There were 8 people in the room when Ruth arrived, including the deputy collector who ran the sale. She recognized none of them. 3 were Englishers farmers in feed caps. 2 were men in business clothes who looked like they might work for a bank or a land company. 1 was a young woman taking notes on a clipboard. And 1 was an older man standing near the window with his arms crossed who did not bid on anything the entire morning. Ruth sat in a chair along the wall and held her notebook in her lap. The sale ran for 1 hour and 40 minutes and covered 11 parcels. The Brubaker ground came up 9th. The deputy collector read the parcel description from a printed sheet. 23 acres, pond, timber, and upland crop ground. 4 years delinquent. Minimum bid $3,391. He looked up and waited. One of the feed cap farmers shifted his weight and looked at his boots. The men from the land company did not move. Nobody spoke. Ruth said, $3,391. The deputy collector looked at her once, looked around the room at nobody moving and said, sold. She paid at the window in certified funds, a cashier's check she had drawn at Farmers and Merchants Bank in Jamesport the previous afternoon. The receipt was a half sheet of yellow paper. She folded it and put it inside the back cover of the notebook. She was back in Harold's truck by 11:15. Harold pulled out of the parking lot and headed north on Route 13. He had the radio on low. After a few miles, Ruth opened the notebook and wrote the date and the amount, and then wrote, got home by 4. She looked out the window at the corn going by, the fields browning at the edges in the August heat, and she thought about water moving through clay at 18 inches of depth, the way it would move if it had somewhere to go. It had cost her $31 for Harold's driving, 2 trips now, including today, and $12 for the soil survey maps at the extension office in Gallatin. With the purchase price, she had spent $3,434 since she first walked the property in May. She had $19.60 left in her passbook account. She ran the arithmetic in her head and then wrote it in the notebook. $3,334 out. $19.90 left. She had told no one in the community what she planned to do with the parcel, except her son-in-law, Aaron, who had driven her out to look at it in his road cart the previous spring, and who had walked the fence line without speaking, and then said, carefully, that he supposed she knew what she was doing. She did not think he believed it. The story of the Brubaker pond ground really began on a Saturday morning in the middle of May, 6 weeks before the tax sale, though Ruth had known about the parcel for longer than that. Word of tax-delinquent ground travels in a farming community the way most practical information does, not through announcement but through the side of conversations about other things. She had heard the parcel mentioned in passing at the feed store the previous fall, when two men were talking about the Brubaker family having moved out of the county years ago and the pond ground sitting empty since. She had gone to the extension office in Gallatin that January, on a day Harold was already making the trip for another family, and she had asked Dale Messick for the county soil survey. Messick was the extension agronomist for Daviess County, a methodical man in his mid-40s with the look of someone who had spent a great deal of time walking wet fields in rubber boots. He pulled the 1982 survey from the shelf and set it on the table and asked what she was looking for. Ruth told him the parcel number and the approximate location. Messick found the relevant soil map sheet and traced the boundary with his finger. He said the upland ground on that parcel was mapped primarily as Grundy Silt Loam, Grundy Series, on 1 to 3% slopes, with some Haney fine sandy loam in the lower drainage. Ruth already knew this. She had been to the NRCS office and pulled the web soil survey printout for the parcel 2 weeks earlier. But she wanted to hear Messick say it, because she wanted to know if he said it the way she thought it should be said, which was with some acknowledgement of what Grundy Silt Loam actually was when it was performing. Messick said it correctly. He said Grundy Silt Loam was a fine smectitic Messick-Eric endoswole with a capability class rating of IIW, limited by seasonal wetness, and that in northern Missouri it was among the most productive soils in the state when drained. He said the claypan subsoil, which began at around 18 to 24 inches in most Grundy profiles, held water above it in spring and created the drainage problem that gave the soil its limitation rating. He said that if you could get the water table below the root zone during the growing season, Grundy ground would perform. He mentioned a corn suitability rating of 77 out of 100. Ruth asked him about the tile drainage history in that part of the county. Messick said that a lot of the farms in the eastern part of Daviess County had been tiled in the 1940s and 1950s, mostly 4-inch and 6-inch clay lines installed by hand and by horse-drawn tile plows, and that a fair number of those lines were either unknown to current owners or had been blocked or rerouted over the years as land use changed. He said it was not unusual to find old tile on a property that nobody had thought about in 50 years. Ruth thanked him and took a copy of MU Extension publication G4220, the Tile Drainage Guide for Missouri Soils, which he gave her from a stack on his shelf. She paid $12 for the soil survey map copies and folded them into a flat envelope she carried inside her coat. She wrote in the notebook that evening, Grundy de W. Drainage is the limitation. Tile from the 1940s, maybe 1950s. Find it. She was at the Brubaker parcel at 7:30 in the morning on May 14th. She had driven Ada, her younger Belgian mare, in the road cart, 4.2 miles from her farmstead. Ada was 12 years old and steady on gravel, and Ruth had no reason to take any other transportation for a trip of that length. She tied Ada to the corner post of a Osage-orange hedgerow along the road shoulder and lifted her bag from the cart. A 100-foot cloth measuring tape borrowed from her son-in-law, a sharpened 3/4-inch fence rod, 18 inches long that she carried for probing, the notebook, and a pencil. The parcel fronted a gravel county road on its south side. There was no gate, only a gap in the woven wire where the Brubakers or someone after them had pulled the wire back and weighted it with a cedar post. Ruth stepped through the gap and stood at the south end of the upland field. The field ran approximately 300 feet north before the ground softened into the margins of the pond basin. She could see the cattail stand from where she was standing, a dense 8-foot wall of Tifa latifolia running across the eastern margin of the pond, with a gap in the middle where the water was visible as a flat green surface, covered perhaps 60% in duckweed. The smell of the pond reached her even from that distance, the flat, organic smell of water with no oxygen movement. She walked the upland field first, The soil surface was compacted and weedy, ragweed and foxtail dominant, with patches of bare ground where erosion had thinned the topsoil on the slight slope. She stopped at several points and drove the fence rod into the ground with the heel of her hand, reading the depth at which it slowed and then stopped. At the first probe point, 15 feet from the road, she hit resistance at 22 inches. At the second, in the center of the field, 18 inches. At the third, near the pond margin, 24 inches, and the rod came out wet and blue-gray below 12 inches. Grundy claypan, exactly where the survey said it would be, moist in mid-May. She wrote the probe depths in the notebook and drew a rough sketch of the field boundary with the probe points marked. She walked the pond margin next, pacing the cattail stand. She counted 110 paces along its length and 40 paces to open water at its deepest point. She walked to the dam face on the south end of the impoundment and stood on the earthen berm, which was about 4 feet high and 15 feet wide at the base, overgrown with brome grass and multiflora rose. She could see the pond surface from the dam top. She estimated the water depth at the dam face at 14 inches, reading against a willow stake that someone had driven into the pond bottom years earlier. For a 9-acre impoundment, 14 inches of average depth indicated a volume of water that was nearly irrelevant. The pond was a wet pasture with pretensions. She walked east along the dam base toward the fence row. This was the part she had come to find. The eastern fence line ran north-south from the county road up to the woodlot. It was an old woven wire fence on cedar posts, most of them still solid, with a rusted barbed wire strand along the top. At the point where the fence crossed the low ground between the pond and the road, there was a concrete culvert under the county road, 18 inches in diameter, and immediately north of the culvert. Inside the fence line, she found the head wall. It was concrete, poured in a simple rectangular form, perhaps 20 inches wide and 16 inches high. The face of it was green with algae and partially covered by a mat of brome and orchard grass that had grown over the front. The mouth of the drain tile was visible in the lower center of the head wall, a round opening approximately 4 inches in diameter. Clay tile, the interior dark with accumulated silt and a white root mass that had worked its way in from the side. Ruth crouched in front of it. She pulled the root mass out with her fingers. It came free in a single piece, a dense mat of fine roots from the brome above. She could see into the tile opening. She pushed the fence rod in. The rod went 6 feet without resistance. She pushed it 7 feet, 8 feet, to the full length of the rod, and it did not meet resistance. The tile was open. The line ran north into the field, toward the high water table and the pond margin, precisely in the direction it would need to run to intercept the perched water above the Grundy claypan. Ruth stayed crouched in front of the head wall for a moment. She looked at the tile opening, and then she looked north toward the pond, where the cattails stood still in the morning air. The dam was 60 yards north of where she was kneeling. The dam had been built in 1967 across the low drainage swale, and when the Brewbakers poured its footings and packed its earthen fill, they had buried this tile line's outlet relationship with the land north of it. The tile could drain the field, but it had nowhere to send the water. The impoundment had grown up behind the blockage the way a backed-up sink fills. 50 years of that, and you got what was in front of her, a ruined pond and ruined ground with Grundy silt loam underneath both of them, waiting. She drew the head wall in the notebook. She noted the tile diameter, the depth of the tile invert below the field surface, the distance from the culvert, and the compass direction the tile ran. She wrote, tile line at east fence, 4 in, clay, ran stake, 6 if toes, open. Dam blocks the outlet. Check the survey. She was measuring the cattail stand. pacing its perimeter with her measuring tape staked at the head wall corner, when she heard footsteps on the other side of the fence. Mervyn Schlabach had come down from the field to the north. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a beard gone gray at the edges, and the unhurried walk of someone who owned the ground he was standing on. He had farmed the 40 acres to the north for 30 years, and he had watched the Brubaker Pond go from a functioning farm impoundment to what it was now, which he regarded as an unpleasant fixture of the landscape. He put his hands on the top strand of fence wire and looked at Ruth across it. "Morning," he said in English. "Morning, Mervyn." He looked at the measuring tape and the notebook and the fence rod, leaning against the head wall. He looked at the pond. He said, "I heard someone was looking at this ground. Ruth said she had been reading about it." Mervyn was quiet for a moment. He said the pond hadn't been right in 15 years, maybe longer. He said 2 men had walked the property earlier in the spring, a father and son who farmed east of the highway, and that neither of them had stayed more than an hour. He said the older one had told him afterward that the pond was a mosquito bog and that the upland ground was beat out. Ruth said she supposed it looked that way. Mervyn looked at the head wall behind her. He said, "What is that?" She told him it was an old drainage tile outlet. She said the line ran north under the field. She said she thought it had been blocked when the dam went in. Mervyn studied the concrete face of the head wall. He was not a man who dismissed things quickly, and she could see him thinking about it. Then he said, "I don't know if that will be enough. This low ground has been wet my whole time here. My father looked at this parcel when we came to the county. He said leave it alone." Ruth said she appreciated him saying so. Mervyn nodded once and walked back up the fence road toward his own field. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the head wall and wrote his comment in the margin of the notebook page, not as evidence of doubt, but as a marker for later. She walked the woodlot before she left, the 4 acres of bur oak and shagbark hickory on the north draw. She counted 22 oak stems of varying size. The 3 largest were between 16 and 18 inches in diameter at breast height, solid trees, worth something in firewood and fence posts, but not in saw timber. The understory had good hickory for splitting. She wrote, "Fair firewood and mast, good fence posts from the understory, no timber claim." She untied Ada from the hedge apple post at 9:45. The mare turned for home without instruction, and Ruth let the reins sit loose and wrote the morning's notes clean in the notebook on the drive back, reading them against the sketch she had made of the field. Total time on property, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Total distance probed, 3 points. Total tile penetration confirmed, 6 feet minimum, unobstructed. Total observed pond depth at dam face, 14 inches over 9 acres. She did not tell herself the thesis was proven. She had a soil series classification and a physical tile line and a blocked outlet. She had a pond that was failing on its own. She had a reasonable hypothesis about what the ground could be with drainage restored. None of it was proven. She wrote a question at the bottom of the morning's notes. How far does the tile run? Is it intact past the 6-foot probe? And below that, what does a main tile line cost to install on 11 acres? She did not have answers to either question yet. She began working on them the following Monday. The winter between the soil survey visit and the tax sale was the research period. Ruth made 3 additional trips to Gallatin with Harold Kincaid. Once to the extension office to go through the tile drainage guide with Messick in detail, once to the NRCS Service Center to pull the drainage soil map for the parcel, and once to meet with a Gallatin attorney named Paul Hendricks to confirm that the parcel had no outstanding liens beyond the delinquent tax amount and that a tax sale deed would convey clean title. Hendricks charged her $275 for a title examination, and told her the deed was clear. He seemed mildly surprised that she was prepared to pay for a full examination on a parcel that hadn't sold to anyone else. But he did the work carefully and his opinion was clear. The tax sale deed would be clean. Harold charged his standard rate, $0.55 per mile, for all 3 trips to Gallatin and back. The round trip was approximately 28 miles. 3 trips came to 40 sazl. Ruth recorded every dollar. Dale Messick, at their second meeting, had spread the NRCS soil map and the tile drainage guide on his table and gone through the hydraulic grade calculations with her for a hypothetical tile system on 11 acres of Grundy silt loam at the parcel's dimensions. He said a main tile at 30-inch depth with 4-inch lateral spurs at 50-foot spacing would lower the effective water table below the clay pan during the critical May and June growing period in most years. He said the outlet elevation at the head wall would need to be confirmed by a contractor before anyone could say the system would drain by gravity to the road culvert. He was careful with his language throughout. He did not tell her the ground would produce. He told her what the ground could do if the conditions were met. He said the tile might be deteriorated beyond use, and that old clay tile lines had a failure rate that increased sharply after 60 or 70 years. He gave her the name of a drainage contractor in Chillicothe, Leon Drury Drainage. Ruth called Drury's shop from the phone at the Jamesport produce auction on a Tuesday morning in October, using the communal phone that the auction permitted Amish sellers to use for business calls. She told Drury she had a tax sale parcel in Daviess County with an old clay tile outlet she wanted inspected and possibly extended, and she asked what he charged for a site visit. Drury said he'd come out and look for nothing if she was serious about doing the work. He said he'd inspected enough old tile lines to know that most of them were either gone or blocked, and that there was no point in pricing a job on a line that wasn't there anymore. Ruth said that was fair. She told him what she had found at the head wall. Drury was quiet for a moment and then said, "You probed 6 feet of open line with a fence rod." "Yes." "All right, that's more than most people find. I'll come out." They arranged to meet at the parcel in late March of the following year, after the frost was out of the ground. Ruth recorded the arrangement in the notebook and the date of the call. By the time she sat in Harold's truck in the courthouse parking lot on August 9th and wrote 3,134 out. In her notebook, she had already done 11 months of work. The tax sale itself was the easiest part of the morning. Leon Drury arrived at the Brubaker parcel on March 28th in a white truck with Drury Drainage stenciled on the door in blue letters. He brought a younger man, his nephew, who drove the equipment trailer. He was perhaps 50, lean, with calloused hands and the careful movements of someone who had spent his life reading ground. Ruth was already there when he pulled up, having come by buggy with Ada. She walked him to the head wall without preliminary conversation. Drury crouched in front of it, ran his hand along the concrete face, looked at the tile opening. He pulled a small LED light from his chest pocket and shone it into the tile. He could see 4 feet of open line before the light scattered. He stood up and looked north toward the pond. He looked at the dam. He looked at the elevation of the head wall relative to the field surface. He said, "The invert is at what, 18 inches?" Ruth said her probe reading was 18 inches at the head wall, which matched the soil survey's estimated claypan depth for the field. Drury looked at the road culvert 10 feet south of the head wall. He said, "If the culvert invert is at or below the tile invert, you've got gravity drainage. If the road's been raised since this was put in, you might have a problem." He walked to the culvert and looked at its south end. He said, "Road's original grade here, I think. Culvert's old. I'd want to level it to be sure." He took a hand level from his truck and confirmed that the culvert invert was approximately 2 inches below the tile head wall invert. The gravity drainage would work. Then he took the tile camera from the truck. It was a contractor's inspection camera on a cable reel, the cable marked in 1-foot increments. He fed it into the tile opening at the head wall. His nephew operated the monitor. They ran it out to 18 feet before the cable met an obstruction. Drury said, "Root intrusion or collapsed joint. Back it up and look." The nephew backed the cable and they watched the monitor. At 17.5 feet, there was a joint gap in the clay tile where the surrounding soil had pressed 2 sections slightly out of alignment. The gap was not a collapse, but it was weeping. Drury said, "That's your problem section. The line's intact on both sides of it. Let's see how far it runs." He fed the camera through the gap and continued. At 31 feet, the camera hit solid silt compaction and stopped. Drury stood up. He said, 31 feet of inspected tile. Could be more beyond the silt plug, could be nothing. The joint at 17 is going to let in roots and soil over time. The good news is the first 30 feet of line runs true and the outlet works." He looked at the field. He said, "What are you thinking for a system?" Ruth had the G4220 guide and her calculations in the notebook. She showed him the sketch she had drawn of the field dimensions. 11 acres of tillable ground to the north and east of the pond. The pond itself at 9 acres. The proposed retention basin at 2.2 acres. She said she wanted a 6-inch perforated main tile line down the center of the tillable ground at 30-inch depth, tied into the existing 4-inch outlet line at the head wall through a reducer fitting, with a control gate standpipe at the pond dam to allow the impoundment to drain to the retention basin elevation, and then hold. Drury looked at the sketch for a long time. He said, "You've thought this through." She said she'd had time. He looked at the field again, at the compacted surface and the cattail stand and the dam. He said, "I've been doing this 22 years, and most of the people who call me have a wet corner they want to fix. This is a different kind of project." He was not saying it as a compliment exactly. He was being accurate. He said he wanted to dig a test pit before he priced the job to confirm the soil profile. He had a hand auger on the trailer. He walked to a point 30 feet into the field from the head wall, in line with where the main tile would run, and augered a hole to 30 inches. The soil came up gray-blue below 12 inches, heavy clay with the characteristic blocky structure of the Grundy B horizon. Drury looked at it for a moment. He pushed a finger into the clay and it left a clean print. He said, "Grundy." Ruth said yes. Drury set the auger down. He said, "Grundy ground that's been waterlogged this long, you get it drained, it'll take a couple of seasons to loosen up. First-year yields will be modest. Second year, you'll start to see the response. Third year, it'll tell you what it is." He looked at the clay in his hand. He said, "I'll give you a price. I'll be honest, I thought when you called that, you were chasing a dry hole, but the ground says something different." He spent another hour measuring the field and establishing grades with his hand level. He said he would call the following week with a price. He said he charged commercial rates and did not do cut rate work. Ruth said that was fine. The price came by letter 11 days later, delivered to the Jamesport post office box Ruth shared with her daughter's family. Drury's proposal was $8,400 for the full scope. Main tile line installation, outlet connection, and head wall rebuild, control gate standpipe at the dam, surface restoration over the trench. He offered 60-day payment terms after project completion. He noted in the letter that he was extending the terms because the soil profile in the test pit had satisfied him that the project was sound. It was the only concession he mentioned. Ruth read the letter twice. She wrote in the notebook, "Drury, $8,400, 60-day terms." He looked at the clay and changed his mind. Then she wrote the updated cost projection. Tile work, $8,400. Dam breach and grading, $1,650. She had called an excavator in Chillicothe and gotten a rough verbal estimate. Earthwork permit through extension, $180. Fence materials already purchased at $890. Attorney fees, $275. Total projected, $11,395, plus the $3,334 already spent, for a total investment of $14,829 before the first crop season. She had $19,966 in her account after the tax sale payment. She would have $5,130 remaining after all projected costs, assuming nothing went wrong. She wrote that figure and looked at it. She did not find the margin comfortable. She found it sufficient. There were 2 permit applications before the drainage work could begin. The Army Corps of Engineers Nationwide Permit 27, which covered pond restoration and modification on agricultural land, required a pre-construction notification submitted through the Kansas City District Office. Dale Messick at the Extension Office had told her about the permit at their second meeting and given her the contact information. He had also told her it typically took 8 to 12 weeks. Ruth submitted the application herself by mail in January with a hand-drawn site map and a 1-page project description she had written at the kitchen table 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She received the authorization 11 weeks later. A 2-page letter from the Corps confirming the project was covered under NWP 27 and did not require an individual permit, with a condition requiring notification to the Missouri DNR before ground disturbance. Ruth filed the DNR notification the same week. Drury's crew arrived on April 3rd. There were 3 men: Drury, his nephew, and a 3rd man who ran the tile plow. The tile plow was mounted on a tracked contractor machine, not a rubber-tired tractor. Ruth was at the property when they started. She watched from the field edge. The tile plow opened the ground in a single pass, cutting a 30-inch slot and laying the perforated 6-inch tile in the same operation. The soil behind the plow closed over the trench, and the surface disturbance was a straight line of disturbed ground across the field. The crew worked north from the headwall connection point, 300 to 40 feet to the upper end of the field. They tied the new 6-inch line to the existing 4-inch outlet with a manufactured reducer coupling at the headwall, rebuilt the headwall face in poured concrete, and installed the control gate standpipe at the dam's north face. The full installation took 1 day and part of a second morning. Ruth wrote, April 3rd. Drury crew started. Line going in at 30 in. Ground opens up gray-blue. Grundy all the way. The excavator came on April 11th, a single machine and operator from Chillicothe, hired for 1.5 days at $1,100 per day. The operator's name wasn't relevant to what he did, which was cut a controlled breach in the south end of the earthen dam, 3 feet wide and calibrated to drain the impoundment to the elevation of the proposed 2.2-acre retention basin. The control gate at the standpipe was opened at the same time. The pond began to drain. It took 9 days. The water level dropped visibly by the first evening, a thin band of exposed mud appearing at the margins below the cattail roots. By the 3rd day, the western quarter of the pond was open, mud flat. The pond's accumulated sediment revealed in layers, dark brown at the surface, gray-green below, with the occasional outline of a drowned fence post or a submerged tree stump that the original pond construction had left in place. By the 6th day, the cattail stand on the east margin was rooted in mud rather than water, and the stand began to lean outward, root mass exposed. By the 9th day, the retention basin held approximately 2 acres of water at the north end of the original impoundment, behind a silt ridge that the contractor had graded to hold the new water level, and the remaining 7 acres of former pond bottom were open sediment. Ruth was there on the 9th day. She walked out onto the pond bottom, testing the sediment with each step. It was firm enough to walk on at the edges and soft in the center where the deepest accumulation was. She probed the sediment with the fence rod. 18 inches of dark, phosphorus-rich, organic muck at the center of the old basin, tapering to 6 inches at the margins. She wrote the measurements in the notebook. She also wrote at the bottom of the page, 7 acres of pond bottom open, Grundy below the sediment. The dam held the water and the water held back the ground. Now neither. Mervyn Schlebach had come down to his fence line on the 3rd day of the draining, when the mudflat was first visible. He watched Drury's standpipe outlet running a thin stream of turbid water through the headwall and into the road culvert. He watched for perhaps 10 minutes. He did not say anything. Ruth was not there that day. Her neighbor to the south told her about it later. Mervyn came back on the day Drury's crew was finishing the tile installation, before the dam breach. He stood at the fence line on the north side of the field and watched the contractor machine work. When Drury walked near the fence on a grade check, Mervyn asked him what they were doing. Drury explained the tile installation. Mervyn was quiet. He said, "I don't know if that'll be enough." Drury said, "It might not be. We'll see what the ground does." Mervyn stayed at the fence for a while and then went back to his field. The total cost of the drainage work was $8,400 to Drury, paid in 2 installments within the 60-day terms, and $1,650 to the excavator, paid on completion. The permit filing had cost $180, the attorneys $275, and the fence materials of $890 had been paid the previous winter. Harold's driving, soil survey copies, and purchase price totaled $3,430. Ruth sat at the kitchen table on the evening of April 21st and added the columns in the notebook. Total spent to date, $14,829. Passbook balance, $8,471. The first crop season was still 6 weeks away, and she had not yet bought seed or arranged the crop share terms with her brother-in-law, David. She wrote the balance and looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote, "Ground is open. Now we wait for what it is." The pond had drained. 7 acres of silted bottom lay open to an April sky, sediment drying at the margins, the retention basin holding its 2 acres of water to the north. The tile ran 30 inches below a field that had not grown a crop in 8 years. The thesis was physical now, not theoretical. It was in the ground and in the rebuilt headwall, and in the standpipe Drury had set at the dam. Whether the ground would perform was a question that required a growing season to answer, and the growing season had not yet begun. Mervyn Schlebach's fence line was visible from the north end of the field, 200 feet away, a straight wire boundary between his worked ground and the open, unfamiliar surface of what had been the Brubaker Pond. He had looked across that boundary twice now and said, both times, that he wasn't sure it would be enough. Ruth thought he might be right. She had spent $14,120 now to find out. Nah. Part 2 follows on instruction. David Yoder farmed 160 acres 3 miles northwest of Ruth's farmstead and had been her brother-in-law for 22 years. He was 51, deliberate in conversation and precise in his field work, and he had said very little about the Brubaker parcel since Ruth had purchased it. He was not dismissive. He had simply waited to see what the drainage work produced before forming an opinion, which was characteristic of him. Ruth approached him in early May about the crop share arrangement. She proposed that he provide the planting and harvest passes using his horse-drawn equipment, and that she supply the seed and her share of the fertilizer inputs, and that he take 1/3 of the harvested crop as his return. David listened to the full proposal before he said anything. Then he said he thought 1/3 was fair for the equipment and labor, given that it was first-year reclaimed ground and the yield was uncertain. He said he would plant soybeans if she wanted because soybeans were more forgiving of variable drainage in the establishment year than corn. Ruth agreed on both points. She wrote the arrangement in the notebook with the date and David's initials beside it. The seed and fertilizer cost for 11 acres of first-year soybeans, with Ruth carrying 2/3 of the fertilizer bill and all of the seed, came to $1,240. David's planting pass happened on May 19th, a dry day with good soil conditions. Ruth walked the field behind the planter for part of the morning, watching the soil. The surface of the former pond margin where the sediment had dried and cracked through April was not planted. That ground was too uneven and too soft in places, and she had agreed with David before they started that they would hold it out and address it the following year with the sediment spreading operation. The 11 acres went in clean. Ruth noted the date and the variety and the seeding rate in the notebook, and then wrote one additional line. Ground worked. Let it tell us. June was wet that year, as June in northern Missouri frequently is, with 3 separate multi-day rain events that put standing water in the low fields across the county. Ruth drove Ada out to the Brubaker parcel on June 14th, 10 days after the last rain, to check the soybean stand. The field was not standing in water. She walked to the center of the field and crouched and looked at the row. The beans were even. The stand was good, and the soil surface between the rows was moist but firm under her boot sole. She pressed the fence rod into the ground beside a plant and felt the clay pan at 21 inches, which was 2 to 3 inches deeper than her May probe readings before the tile went in. The water table had dropped. The tile was moving water. She walked to the east fence line to check the outlet. The head wall was running a thin, clear trickle into the road culvert. Clear, not turbid. The silt that had come through in the first weeks after installation had cleared. The system was running clean. She wrote the date and the observation. June 14th. Stand even across all 11 AC tile running clear. Water table at 21 in the center field. She was still riding when she heard footsteps at the fence line to the north. Mervyn Schlabach came down through his field at his unhurried walk and stopped at the wire. He looked at the soybean stand. Ruth stood up and they looked at it together for a moment without speaking. Mervyn said, "It's standing." Ruth said yes. He said, "I had 3 inches of water in my low corner after the June rains. Took 10 days to drain off." He looked at her field. This drained faster. She said the tile had helped with that. Mervyn put his hands on the top wire of the fence and looked north to south across the full length of the field. He said, "What did you yield off this ground last year?" She said there had been no crop last year. This was the first season. He nodded. He looked at the stand a while longer. Then he said, "How deep did you put the main line in?" She told him 30 inches. He said nothing more for a time. Then he said, "I have a corner on my North 40 that's been wet since we came here. My father wrote it off. I've written it off." He looked at the head wall outlet running its thin, clear stream into the culvert. He said, "I always thought it was the soil." Ruth said, "It might be the soil, but it might be the water table. The soil survey would tell you which one." Mervyn looked at her once with an expression she could not fully read. It was not skepticism exactly. It was the face of a man recalculating something he had believed for a long time. He said he appreciated the thought and walked back up the fence line to his own ground. Ruth watched him go. She wrote in the margin of that day's notebook page, the same margin where she had noted his comment on the first morning. June 14th. He's looking at the soil survey. The soybean harvest came in the 3rd week of October. David ran the binder and the threshing operation with his equipment, and the yield from 11 acres was 308 bushels. Ruth was at the field for the harvest. She helped with the wagon work, and at the end of the day she wrote the yield number in the notebook and did the arithmetic beside it. 308 bushels at the cash price of $10.40 per bushel was $3,203 gross. David's one-third share was $1,068. Ruth's net from the first crop was $2,135. She updated her running cost figure, which now stood at $14,829 in total costs against $2,035 in returned revenue, for a net position of negative $12,694 going into winter. She called Dale Messick at the extension office the following week from the produce auction phone. She told him the yield. There was a brief pause on the line, and Messick said, 28 bushels per acre. First year on reclaimed wet ground, after a wet June. That's a reasonable start. He said he would have expected somewhere between 22 and 32 bushels per acre in the establishment year, given the drainage conditions and the soil's history of compaction and low organic matter. He said the number that would tell him more was the second-year yield after the tile had run through a full freeze-thaw cycle and the clay pan had begun to open up. Ruth wrote his words in the notebook, compressed. Messick, 28. BU reasonable. Second year will tell more. Clay pan needs time to open. David came to the fence line when she was leaving the field after harvest and said, without particular emphasis, that the yield had surprised him. He said he had expected less from first-year ground with that kind of water history. Ruth told him what she had told Mervyn Schlabach in June, that the soil knew what it was supposed to do. David considered this and said he supposed that was true. The second crop year began in March with the soil testing that Dale Messick had recommended at their first meeting. Ruth pulled soil samples from 6 locations across the 11 acres, following the extension sampling grid instructions in G4220, and sent them to the MU Extension Soil Testing Lab in Columbia. And the results came back in 2 weeks. pH 5.9, low phosphorus, adequate potassium, organic matter at 2.1%. Low pH and low phosphorus were expected on ground that had been unproductive for 8 years. Messick reviewed the results when Ruth brought them to Gallatin and said the ground needed 2 tons of lime per acre and a phosphorus application at planting. The lime cost $55 per ton applied. 2 tons per acre on 11 acres was 22 ton total at $1,210. Ruth arranged the lime through a Chillicothe supplier who could deliver and spread with a truck-mounted spreader, which was permissible under the district's ordnung as a hired contractor service. The fertilizer was factored into the second year's crop share input cost. In April, before the planting season, Ruth arranged for the pond sediment to be spread on the 4 acres of thin upland ground at the south end of the parcel. The upland soil in that area had lost most of its topsoil to decades of erosion, and the NRCS survey showed it as the thinnest and most depleted section of the Grundy profile on the property. The pond sediment, which had dried through the previous summer and fall into a crumbly, dark material that smelled of phosphorus and organic matter, was available at no extraction cost. Ruth hired an English operator with a skid steer for 1 day at $480 to push and spread the sediment across the 4 upland acres. This was documented practice. The MU Extension publications on pond management noted that farm pond sediment accumulated nutrients and organic matter from agricultural runoff over time, and that dried pond sediment could be spread as a low-grade soil amendment on adjacent fields. Ruth did not claim it would transform the upland ground. She wrote in the notebook, sediment spread on South 4A Sibrawaso amendment, not miracle. Give it 2 seasons. David planted soybeans again in the second year at Ruth's request. She wanted a second data point on the drainage response before she committed to a corn rotation. The planting and input costs ran approximately the same as the previous year. The summer was drier than the first, which in a normally drained field would have stressed the crop, but on the Brubaker ground, it meant the tile was not needed for drainage in June and July, and the crop ran on stored profile moisture without waterlogging. The second-year soybean yield was 418 bushels from 11 acres, 38 bushels per acre. Ruth did the arithmetic in the notebook the evening after harvest. 418 bushels at 10.40 per bushel was 4,347 gross. David's one-third share was $1,249. Ruth's net was $2,190. She updated the running position. Total costs through year 3, including the lime and sediment work, stood at $16,509. Total revenue to date was $5,032. Net position, negative $11,487. She also harvested 4 cords of firewood from the woodlot that fall, working with a neighbor's crosscut saw and her own splitting maul over several Saturdays. She sold the wood locally at $180 per cord to 3 Englisher households near Jamesport. Revenue, $720. She recorded it. Net position after year 3, negative $10,767. The numbers were moving in the right direction, but they were moving slowly. Ruth did not find this discouraging. She had known from the beginning that the drainage work was a multi-year investment and that the Grundy clay pan needed time to respond structurally to the lowered water table. Messick had told her 2 seasons before the ground would tell her what it was. She was in the 2nd season and it was beginning to tell her. The 3rd crop year, she switched to corn. David agreed to continue the crop share arrangement on the same 1/3 terms. He planted the 11 acres with a horse-drawn corn planter in early May. The season was average for northern Missouri, adequate rain in June and a dry stretch in late July that put mild stress on the crop but did not cut the yield significantly. The corn stood well from early in the season. Ruth was at the field on the 1st of June and noted in the notebook that the color was even across all 11 acres, including the former pond margin area that had been marginal in the first 2 seasons. The clay pan, after 2 freeze-thaw cycles and 2 years of root penetration by the soybean crop, had begun to open. The soil was not what it would be in 10 years, but it was no longer what it had been. On June 7th, Ruth was checking the corn stand when Mervyn Schlebach came to the fence line. She had not spoken with him since the previous June, when he had stood at the wire looking at the soybean stand and mentioned his North 40 corner. He came down the fence line slowly and stopped. He looked at the corn for a long time without speaking. The stand was even and green, the plants at 18 inches, uniform across the field. The former pond margin was visible as a slightly darker strip of soil, where the organic matter from the sediment spread was still working into the profile, but the crop on that strip was as good as anywhere else in the field. Mervyn said, "That's a good stand." Ruth said she was pleased with it. He said, "What do you think you'll yield?" She said she was hoping for 140 to 145 bushels per acre, which would be below the county average, but reasonable for the 3rd crop year on this ground. Mervyn was quiet. He looked at the stand another moment. Then he said he had pulled the county soil survey for his farm the previous winter. He said he had read the Grundy description and the drainage limitation language, and that he had gone and looked at his wet north corner with different eyes than he had used before. He said there was an old tile line on his property too, mapped on a 1951 farm plan that his father had kept and that Mervyn had never paid attention to. He said he didn't know if the line was still intact. Ruth said that a contractor's tile camera would tell him in an hour. He said he knew. He said he'd called Drury's number but hadn't set a date yet. He said he supposed he was still thinking about it. Ruth said there was no hurry. Mervyn nodded. He looked at the corn one more time, the way he had looked at the soybean stand the year before, with the patient, evaluating attention of a man who had spent his life reading crops and ground. He said, "I should have pulled the soil survey 30 years ago." He did not say it with regret exactly. He said it as a plain statement of fact, the way a carpenter might note that a cut had gone slightly off true. He walked back up the fence line. Ruth watched him go. She wrote in the notebook, June 7th, corn standing well. Mervyn came to the fence. He pulled the soil survey. There's tile on his north corner, too. He'll call Drury. The corn harvest came in at 142 bushels per acre. 11 acres produced 1,562 bushels. At the cash price of $4.35 per bushel, gross revenue was $6,895. David's one-third share was $2,298. Ruth's net was $4,527. She had also, in the spring of that year, leased the 2.2-acre retention pond to a sportsman's club from Chillicothe, 6 men who fished together on weekends and wanted a private pond for bluegill and bass. The lease was a simple one-page agreement, signed in April at $600 per year. The pond had been stocked the previous fall with 200 bluegill fingerlings and 50 largemouth bass purchased from a hatchery in Trenton for $160, a cost Ruth absorbed as a one-time setup expense. The Sportsman's Club members had restocked it themselves since then. She also harvested 80 fence posts from the bur oak understory in the woodlot that fall. Posts she cut herself on 2 Saturdays with her son-in-law Aaron and his brother. She sold them at $8 each to 3 farms in the community. Revenue, $640. Ruth added the year 4 revenue to her running total. Corn net, $4,527. Fishing lease, $600. Fence posts, $640. Year 4 revenue, $5,767. Cumulative revenue through year 4, $11,509. Total costs through year 4, $16,679, including the hatchery stocking and minor fence maintenance. Net position at the close of year 4, negative $5,160. The ground was close to paying back its own costs. She did not say this to anyone. She wrote the numbers in the notebook and moved on to the next column. On the morning of May 14th, in the 4th year after her first walk, Ruth drove Ada out to the Brubaker parcel before the day's work began. She had not planned the date deliberately when she set out. She was going to check the tile outlet after a wet week, the same practical errand she ran several times each spring. She was tying Ada to the hedge apple post at the road shoulder when she looked at her notebook to write the date and saw what it was. May 14th. She stood at the road for a moment. Then she walked down the fence line to the eastern headwall. The concrete Drury's crew had poured 3 years earlier was weathered now, gray and solid, with a thin crust of algae at the waterline on its face. The tile outlet ran a clear stream of water, good volume for the wet week, the flow steady and without turbidity. She crouched in front of the headwall and put her hand below the outlet and felt the water. Cold, clear, without suspended sediment. She looked at the ground around the headwall, the raw mud she had knelt in on this same morning 4 years ago. The mud she had pushed the fence rod through to find an open tile line was gone. In its place, a dense mat of white clover, Trifolium repens, had colonized the area around the concrete collar and spread outward 6 feet in every direction, the plants small and even and threaded through with their pale 3-leaf pattern. The clover had come on its own, no seeding. It had found the better-drained, higher organic ground around the rebuilt headwall and taken hold. Ruth listened to the water moving in the tile. She could hear it before it reached the outlet, a faint sound in the ground, water in a clay pipe 30 inches down, moving through Grundy silt loam that was darker and looser now than it had been when Drury's auger brought it up 3 years before. She opened the notebook. She wrote, May 14th, 4 years. Water running clean. She stayed crouched at the headwall a moment longer. Then she stood and walked back to Ada and drove home. Margaret Sill had been the loan officer at Farmers and Merchants Bank in Jamesport for 17 years. Ruth had banked there since before Eli died. Sill was careful and methodical, and she had never tried to talk Ruth into or out of anything financial, which Ruth respected. When Ruth had opened the separate project savings account in year 1, Sil had noted the purpose without comment. When Ruth had come to pay for the tile work, Sil had processed the withdrawals without offering an opinion. In the fall of year 4, Ruth brought 2 years of crop yield records and the fishing lease agreement to the bank and asked Sil about an operating line of credit. She said she was considering expanding the tile drainage to the south 4 acres in the following spring, which would require another investment in contractor work, and she wanted a production line rather than drawing down her savings further. Sil looked at the yield records. 308 bushels first year, 418 second year, 1,562 bushels of corn in year 4. She looked at the lease agreement. She looked at the fence post revenue notation Ruth had included for completeness. She was quiet for a moment, adding things in her head. Then she said, "What is the property worth now, do you think?" Ruth said she didn't know. She had an opinion, but it was not an appraisal. Sil said she would need an appraisal before she could use the property as collateral for a production line. She said she could recommend an appraiser if Ruth wanted. She said his name was Daniel Orth, and he worked out of Chillicothe and held the MAI designation, which was the senior credential in the appraisal profession. She said he was thorough and did not produce optimistic numbers. Ruth said that was fine. She said she would rather have an accurate number than a favorable one. Sil looked at her for a moment and said, "In 17 years here, I've had people say that, and most of them meant the opposite. I think you mean it." Ruth said she did. Daniel Orth came to the property in late February of year 5, when the ground was clear of snow and the soil surface was visible. He spent 2.5 hours walking the parcel. He had reviewed the tax assessment, the county soil survey mapping, and the yield records Ruth had provided in advance. He walked the tile outlet, paced the tillable acreage, examined the retention pond and the lease agreement, walked the woodlot, and probed the soil at 4 points. He did not say much while he was working. At the end of the walk, he stood at the head wall and looked north across the field for a minute. He said, "The Grundy ground is performing." Ruth said it had taken 2 seasons to open up. He said, "It usually does." He looked at the tile outlet. He said he had appraised a number of reclaimed drainage properties in the region over the years, and that the trajectory on this one was clear in the yield records. He said his comparable sales analysis would drive the number more than the income approach at this parcel size, but that the income history would support the comparable conclusion. The appraisal report arrived at the bank 6 weeks later. Orth had appraised the full 23.17-acre parcel at $187,000. The report cited 3 comparable sales of drained Grundy silt loam, mixed parcels in Daviess and adjacent counties, ranging from $7,600 to $9,100 per acre, and concluded a value of $8,073 per acre for the Brubaker ground, reflecting its partial reclamation status, the retained pond acreage, and the woodlot. The income from the crop share and the fishing lease supported the conclusion. Ruth read the appraisal report at the bank, sitting across from Margaret Sil's desk. Sil had a copy on her desk. Sil said, "I've been here 17 years, and I have not seen a parcel improve this much in appraised value in that time." She said it plainly, as a professional observation rather than a compliment. Ruth had purchased the parcel for $3,391 and invested a further $13,788 in improvements and operating costs, for total costs of $16,379. The parcel was now appraised at $187,000. She had, at that point, recovered $11,019 in crop and lease revenue for net cash costs of $5,160 still unrecovered. The year 5 crop and lease revenue would close that gap and put her into positive net cash territory. She did not say any of this to Sil. She said, "Can you do the line?" Sil said yes. She approved a $40,000 operating line of credit at 6.9% interest, secured against the property. She said she had not expected to be approving that number against that parcel when Ruth first opened the project account 4 years earlier. She said she was glad to be wrong. Dale Messick came to the field that summer at Ruth's invitation. She had told him by letter that she was in the 5th season and that she wanted him to see the stand before she put the ground through its first full corn rotation year since the reclamation. He came on a Thursday afternoon in late June, driving out in his extension pickup. He walked the full field with Ruth, stopping at several points to examine the crop and to probe the soil. At the center of the field, he augured a sample to 30 inches. The soil above the clay pan was darker than the profile Drury had pulled from the same location 3 years earlier. Messick held the soil in his hand. He said, "The organic matter is building back." He said that was faster than he would have predicted for Grundy ground with this history. He attributed it to the soybean root mass from 2 establishment years and the sediment-amended south acres beginning to influence the adjacent ground through biological activity. He said, "The clay pan loosened up faster than I expected after you got the water table down." He looked at the stand. The ground responded. He said it the way someone says something they had thought was likely but had waited to confirm. He wrote a letter for Ruth's loan file that month, at Sill's request. The letter noted that he had consulted on the drainage project from its planning phase and had monitored the yield progression over the course of 4 growing seasons, and that in his professional assessment, the drainage system was functioning as designed and the soil was responding to reduced waterlogging in the expected pattern. He noted the second-year yield improvement and the corn stand quality in the current season. He said the trajectory of the property was clear. Ruth was at the kitchen table in September, the year's work mostly finished, when she heard a buggy turn into her lane. She went to the window. Mervyn Schlabach's road cart was at the gate. This was unusual. Mervyn did not visit without occasion. He came to the door and Ruth brought him inside and set water on. He sat at the table and said without preamble that he had called Leon Drury in the spring and that Drury had come out and run the tile camera on his north corner tile line. He said the line was intact to 40 feet, which was far enough to confirm the system, and that there were 2 joint gaps similar to what Drury had found on the Brubaker line, but that both sections were still functional. He said Drury had given him a price for a main tile installation on 6 acres of his North 40 wet corner. Ruth said, "Are you going to do it?" Mervyn said he thought he was. He said he had been looking at the yield maps from his north corner for the past 3 years, and the loss was consistent enough that the tile investment would pay back in 4 or 5 seasons if the drainage responded the way Ruth's ground had responded. He said he had run the arithmetic himself. He said, "I wanted to ask if you still had the extension tile spacing guide, the one from Messick's office." Ruth went to the shelf where she kept the extension publications and found G4220. She also brought the notebook to the table and opened it to the page with the notes from her first tile consultation with Messick, the page where she had sketched the hydraulic grade calculation for 11 acres and written the drainage coefficient figures Messick had walked her through. She set both on the table. Mervyn looked at the notebook page for a while. He read the calculations. He looked at the sketch of the field layout with the tile spacing marked. He was quiet. Ruth said he could borrow both and return them when he was done. Mervyn picked up the guide and the notebook, careful with both. He said, "I told my father's memory that the wet corner was the soil. For 30 years I told myself the same thing." He set the guide on top of the notebook and straightened them. He said, "It was the water." He left 2 weeks later with a note folded inside the front cover of the soil drainage guide. "Thank you. I think there might be something there. The 5th crop year closed in October with corn off 11 acres at 154 bushels per acre, 1,384 bushels at 435. Gross 6,090. David's 1/3 share, 2,297. Ruth's net, 4,593. The fishing lease paid at $600 in April. The fence post harvest that fall was smaller, 40 posts at $8 each, $320. Total year 5 revenue, $5,530. Ruth updated the notebook one last time for the year. Cumulative revenue through year 5, $17,000 out of the 32. Total cumulative costs, $16,679. Net cash position, positive $353. The ground had paid back every dollar she had put into it, and then a little more, and it was appraised at $187,000 on a $3,391 purchase. She held an asset worth $187,000 against total invested costs of $16,679, with a $40,000 operating line secured against it at a rate she could service easily from annual crop revenue. She had not borrowed to do the reclamation work. She had used savings, extended payment terms from a contractor who had believed the soil profile he saw in a test pit, and patience extended across 5 growing seasons. She turned to the last used page of the notebook and wrote the final accounting in 2 columns, costs and revenues, the way she had written every other entry, plainly with exact figures, with the date at the top. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote one thing. The ground was always there. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the Daviess County Soil Survey and the tile drainage guide she had not yet returned to Messick because she had been using it to answer Mervin's questions. Outside, the October light was flat and good on the fields. The retention pond held its 2 acres, the water dark in the afternoon light, and the tile ran somewhere 30 inches below the ground, carrying water it had always been meant to carry, through Grundy silt loam that had been waiting, under a failed pond and 8 years of weeds and 4 years of accumulated taxes, for someone to read the soil survey carefully enough to understand that condition is not the same thing as nature, and that the distance between what a piece of ground looks like and what it actually is can sometimes be measured in the length of a fence rod pushed into a clay tile on a May morning, 6 feet of open line with nowhere to go. The ground was always there, always. Ruth Mast had simply looked long enough to see it. If you've ever walked past something that everyone else had written off, you already understand what this story is actually about. The numbers were real. The patience was real. The tile was in the ground the whole time. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. 1 decision a week with the real numbers.